Hello, everybody. Here to, well, I'm rolling a blunt first. Um, it's called Fatso. It's fantastic. Really, this is a video in response to Eddy Constantino or whatever his name is. Like, I don't care. I'm not gonna sit there and go back and forth with some rando on YouTube. Not gonna do it. I don't have time for that shit. So I'll just make my own video. 2023, and I have a laptop. So we're going to talk about AC/DC, Back in Black. One of my favorite bands. Of course, everybody, the album's ubiquitous. We all grew up with it. We've all heard so many songs from it on the radio. And the generally accepted story is, you know, Bon Scott passed away, had only played drums on a couple of demos and hadn't written any lyrics or anything. Snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. The Young brothers found the perfect replacement in Brian Johnson, who basically wrote the album on the way to the studio, and they cranked it out, and it was the #2 best-selling record of all time. And they went on with their career. So we'll back up a little bit, and we'll talk about AC/DC and the history of AC/DC. Um, and you can't really talk about the history of AC/DC without talking about the Easy Beats and George Young, Angus and Malcolm's older brother, his partner Harry Vanda. They were the guitar players in a band called the Easy Beats, and they were like the biggest band in Australia in the 1960s. They had a huge hit called Friday on My Mind, which is a really good song. They had a few good songs. But, in the 60s, when you had hits, the pressure was to kind of keep up with, the chart success. And times were changing, the way music changed. Uh, George Young and Harry Vanda tried to kind of curtail their writing to make hits. So they weren't really able to do that and it kind of fell apart. But what they did do when they were doing that is they really learned how to write songs really well. They were really good at what they did. And so when they went back to Australia, they hooked up with their production company, the company that had produced the Easy Beats, called Albert Productions, with a with producer. You know, they had a job. They were producers. And so their job was to find acts and produce them for Albert Productions. And they did that with a lot of acts. One of them was Stevie Wright, who was the lead singer of the Easy Beats. And on his album, George enlisted the help of his younger brother Malcolm to play guitar because Malcolm was a really good guitar player. Turns out their youngest brother Angus is really, really good too. And out of all the types of music that George Young and Harry Vanda were into producing, what their raison d'etre was to bring the hard driving sound of Australian guitar to the world. And luckily, George Young's little brothers were kind of aligned with that, Angus and Malcolm, so they started the band AC/DC. And within a year of starting the band, they had hired Bon Scott to be the lead singer. Now, Bon Scott had been in a band for Albert's called the Valentines back in the 60s during the time of the Easy Beats. They had a song called My Old Man's a Groovy Old Man. And, so Bon wasn't unknown. They all knew who he was. He had also been in a band called Fraternity, played flute, sang, wrote songs. He was a hippie. So, like a wood hippie. Like the Valentines were like psychedelic pre hippie, like British beat, Paul Revere and the Raiders type. But Fraternity was a straight up fucking hippie band. Like they lived on a commune and shit. So Bon had been in a few bands, and he'd played drums and was pretty well versed. And AC/DC and Bon Scott fit like a glove. And the thing that really set Bon apart from everyone else is outside of his persona and his charisma, because he was very charismatic. But man, he's a great songwriter. He wrote melodies. He helped her. That's my dog Lola snoring. Everybody, it's like 3 in the morning. He Bon Scott was a. So I'm gonna break it down how songwriters work. People consider me a songwriter, and I'm not. Okay, Ryan's the songwriter. He's the one with the melodies. Just because I come up with chords and riffs and maybe even a hook and some lyrics doesn't make me a songwriter. It just doesn't. The songwriter is the person with the melody and the ability to take, like if I come in with some riffs, some chords, and I'm like, yeah, cool, this is a hook, it's a little something. Well, the songwriter actually takes that and provides real structure to it and gives it a thread. And the songwriter writes the melodies. If you if you write a song and get it copyrighted, if you write a song and get it copyrighted, what you're copywriting are the lyrics and the melody. Not right. You're not copywriting riffs. You're not copywriting chord progressions. It's not how it works. So Angus and Malcolm, they're like me. They're like bricklayers or foremen, job foremen. Is a great way. You make sure that the right parts get ordered. You make sure that the right material gets delivered to the job site, and that the people are going to implement that material in the right way. I do that. You know, I add, I add lyrics. I'll maybe add a bridge to something like, but I don't come in with fully formed songs, and I don't write strong melodies. Just don't have that gift. And I'm okay with that. I've always been okay with it. I understand it. I work within the confines of it. So that's how Angus and Malcolm were. They were like me. Vaughn, however, man, he had that gift. And that was obvious. And, as a songwriter, you refine your gifts. You get better at what you do. Like I'm better at what I do now than I was 10 years ago. So as ACDC kind of progressed and they went to America and they toured more and they made more records, but they got better at writing songs. Um, to the point where, Powerage is, I mean, to me, the best ACDC album. It's dark, it's real, and you can tell that the Youngs didn't censor Bond as much, especially with stuff like Gone Shooting. I think a lot of people don't even realize that it is, it's about heroin. um, and it's about Bond's girl, I sang her favorite tune, or she stirred the coffee with the same spoon. I sang her favorite tune, but she's gone shooting. Can't keep her around because she's driven by this drug. You know, um, she never made it past the bathroom door. What was she aiming for? She's gone shooting. Oof. Like, and to me, the first one is like, she's gone. She's not here. She's got to go find that, do whatever she's got to do to make that happen. And then the second verse is, she might be there, but she's not really there. She's gone. Um, just fantastic songwriting and imagery and depth. The people don't understand the depth of a lot of the lyrics of Bon Scott. Like they take it as such surface value. Um, but man, it's like 3D. There are levels and layers to what he was writing because he was a songwriter. So that there's that. You know, the problem is he also was an alcoholic, and um, they called him Ronnie Road Test because he'd take anything. And there's a lot of evidence that when he came back to London in early 1980, that his people were even further into the heroin scene. And Bond, wanting to celebrate the fact that he had finished writing the lyrics for the follow up to Highway to Hell, an album that he called Back in Black. Said, I wrote a new song called Back in Black. It's about how this album's going to put us over the top. Like we've been touring America and working our asses off, and 7 years on the road, and, ready to. Well, they weren't on the road for 7 years. What was it, for 5 years, 6 years, And this is going to be the one that's going to put us over the top, and I'm going to be out of the red and into the black, and that's what that song is about. And if you look at it, it's about you know becoming financially stable, and like all the hard work that you've put in is paying off. That's why he's back in black. It's not a tribute to Bon Scott. It's the fucking dumbest shit I've ever heard. It never made sense to me when I was a kid, and now I know why. uh, so Bon goes out celebrating Alistair Kinnear. There's several YouTubes on what happened there, but really, they were at a place called the Music Machine. People were doing heroin. Bon probably did a line, did a couple lines, had some drinks, and kind of passed out in the car on the way back to his house. And Alistair freaked out. And it's possible Bon died in the car while dude was driving. Okay. And that he was dead by the time they got back to Alistair's apartment. That they let either brought him in the apartment for a day or left him out in the car. And if they left him out in the car, my suspicion is because they were all high on heroin and forgot about him. Shit happens like that. It does. So, however it fucking shook out, Bond died. Fucking, just died in somebody's car. Um, a senseless tragedy, ridiculous. No one's fault per se. Bond's for doing the heroin. You still got to go ahead and throw that out at him. Um, but the reality is AC/DC. It's entirely possible that while they had Bond's body, that Alistair Kinnear and that group of people had Bond's body, that people already knew he was dead. Like the word was already getting out. It's like, man, Bond died. Bond's dead. And AC/DC was called in the middle of the night. The Youngs were called in the middle of the night. Peter Mensch and Ian Jeffrey were dispatched, or Peter Mensch dispatched Ian Jeffrey to go to Bond's apartment. And they cleaned his apartment out of everything. The only thing Bond's parents got back was the knapsack he left Scotland with, or excuse me, the knapsack he left Australia with. He was born in Scotland, but they emigrated from Australia to London. When AC/DC left Australia, he brought a knapsack with him and had some clothes, not much, and that's all he got back. Like all of his belongings were wiped out of his apartment. Any notebooks, songs in them. Not that they needed to steal his notebooks for Back in Black, because the way AC/DC worked was it was a dictatorship. It was ran by the Youngs. George Young, being the figurehead who'd signed them, he was the older brother, produced all the early albums for Albert Productions. He was still very much a part of everything, even though after Powerage they recruited Mutt Lange to come in and produce Highway to Hell, which was their big breakthrough in the U.S. Um, George Young, Angus, and Malcolm were like the final overseers of everything AC/DC, even at that time. It was their band, their family business. They were set out on world domination. It was their path. And so Bon had handed in his final draft of lyrics for the songs that they had been working on for Back in Black. Let me go ahead and stress that. More than one account, including Pete Way from UFO, have attested that Bon had told them that he had finished writing the lyrics for the new album called Back in Black. The Young brothers even admit Bon had been in the studio with him working on the songs. That he hadn't written any lyrics or anything yet. He just played drums on a couple of tracks. Well, what were those tracks? Oh, it's changed from "Let Me Put My Love Into You" to and "Hell's Bells" to um, "What Do You Do for Money" and "Have a Drink on Me." So their stories change. Simon Wright from AC/DC, who replaced Phil Rudd in 1983, says, "Yeah, Angus played me a cassette of Back in Black with Bon Scott playing drums." Oh, so Bon was playing on his own tribute song. You can get into all this, whatever. I have a really hard time believing that Bon is as the songwriter and the lyricist and the melodic writer, the actual songwriter in the band. I have a really hard time that he was just coming in and hanging out and playing drums and not really writing songs. That's not how it works. That's just not. If he was in there playing drums on the songs, he was helping them arrange them because they were writing them already. Because that's what they did. AC/DC was a working band. They didn't dick around. Right? From all accounts I've heard, is those guys worked. They had a work ethic, and still do. That never changed. You're going to roll up your sleeves and you're going to get it done. So that's what they were doing in there. They were writing those songs. You can't tell me for a minute that Bon wasn't in there, arranging and being like, yeah, this part goes here, and then I'm going to do this, and you know. And so once they got all those done and were ready, and like the form and the shape was there, then it was time to write the lyrics. And so Bon sat down that week and cranked out the final draft of songs like "You Shook Me All Night Long," where you know Bon Scott had a girlfriend in America who had a horse named Double Time. They used to go riding horses together in Florida. She was working double time on the seduction line. Yeah. Brian fucking Johnson had never been to America before he joined AC/DC. He'd never been to America before the tour for Back in Black. How was she knocking him out with her American thighs? Oh, the same girl who had a horse named Double Time? Bon had told her, and there's a book where she gives kind of a testimony. He said that I had chartreuse eyes. Telling her no lies? One, the youngs go for simplicity and they probably like, what's chartreuse? They don't even know what the fuck that word is. Brian Johnson ain't gonna sing that. That's not. So they just changed a little bit of something. But that song was written, man. Brian Johnson's account of, yeah, I just wrote it in 15 minutes when I got to the Bahamas. I saw a girl on the TV or on the beach or something. She looked like she was American and she had thighs, and I was inspired. Bullshit. It's Bon Scott's life. Fucking ridiculous. What do you do for money, honey? Who was hanging out with women who had lakefront apartments that were paid for by other men? Wasn't the Youngs. Sure shit wasn't Brian Johnson. Fucking Manchester, Birmingham, or where the fuck he was at. Nah, man. Bon Scott. That was his life. Shoot to Thrill. Another heroin song. First of all, none of those guys would catch up on those references. Too many women, too many pills. Who was living that life? That's Bon Scott's life. Again. And even Brian Johnson says, you can look up this interview. I mean, I'm not going to look this shit up again. I don't give a fuck that much. I'm just spitballing. I'm just telling y'all why everybody who's like, Brian wrote Black and Black, you're all fucking dumb if you think that. Brian even said, Bon Scott wrote true stories. He wrote about his life, whereas Brian Johnson doesn't. He says, I just make stuff up. Okay. Well, the songs on Back in Black are about Bon Scott's life. Back in Black, getting back financially, having drink on me. Um, Silver Smith even said that she had a postcard from Bon that had the line, she told me to come, but I was already there. It's total Bon Scott line, the double entendre, the layers. It's like, yeah, there's a sexual component, but, there's more to it than that. Sex is just a part of it, you know. So, we've discussed that. Let's look at this timeline. Even in the best of situations when you're in a working band, shit doesn't always go to plan, right? And there are hang-ups and you just kind of roll with things. Spawn died, they were ready. They went and cleaned out his apartment, and they hired Brian Johnson, and they rolled with it. Nobody could have planned it out this fucking good. Bon Scott died in February 1980. AC/DC holds auditions in March 1980. Brian Johnson is announced as their new singer in April 1980. They fly to the Bahamas, Compass Point Studios, meet up with Tony Platt, Mutt Lange, fly all their gear and their crew to the Bahamas, record the album in May, mix it and master it in June. It's out on the street in July. If they would have waited a couple of months, it would have made that whole scenario a lot more believable, a lot more plausible. Fact of the matter is, they didn't have time to write that fucking album. They just didn't. And I forget what his name is, Tony Kess, whatever, the guy whose video is stupid that I didn't watch. He was like, well, that's just how working bands were back then. They just cranked them out, man. They blah, blah, blah. Okay. I get it. But in this scenario, that would have to, you would have to make room for the fact that a lot of those songs were already written. In order to pull it off in that amount of time, Brian Johnson says he wrote You Shook Me All Night Long in 15 minutes after seeing a girl. Just inspired. The dude that never wrote shit. In Geordie, his band before AC/DC, okay, he wrote like 4 songs. Co-wrote. Like me. Somebody else brought the song in and he helped write some lyrics or some shit and got a co-write. A songwriter. That's what he did in Geordie. Oh, and by the way, the songs in Geordie fucking suck. That's why they never did anything. I mean, they don't suck. They're just not, they don't pop out. They don't come at you like Hell's Bells. Which, oh, by the way, Bon Scott loved writing a song about his balls. Hell's Bells got me ringing. Rolling thunder, pouring rain, coming on like a hurricane. So, yeah, Brian's not a songwriter, has never really written songs, joins AC/DC and is like, oh, yeah, I just cranked out Back in Black, the whole album, on the way to the studio. Somewhere in between April and May of 1980. Wrote these songs in 15 minutes. Those are the kind of songs people work their entire lives towards. Those are the kind of songs that, I don't know, Bon Scott had been in bands for 10 years working and writing songs and refining his skills to get to that point. The arrangements of them. The way AC/DC changed after Back in Black isn't just lyrically. The arrangements of the songs changed. The way their songs were structured changed. The way they were written changed after that album. Everybody's like, oh, well, Mutt Lange had so much to do with it. Yeah, he had a lot to do with cleaning up their sound. You compare the records that, Vanda and Young produced versus, like, say, Highway to Hell and Back in Black. The big difference is, like, the backing vocals are in tune. There's a little sparkle production-wise. But the biggest, I mean, there's not as big of a change, say, from Highway to Hell to Back in Black, other than Brian's vocals. Song wise, the writing, the craft, the arranging, very similar. Tell it those songs were written by the same people. Touch Too Much is a great indicator of, where they were headed with Back in Black. Highway to Hell, the song Highway to Hell, very similar structurally, sonically. You know, two different lead singers recorded at two different studios at two different times, but the core of the band's the same, the producer's the same, engineer's the same. Tony Platt engineered, Mutt Lange produced. So they go down there, they blast out Back in Black in like fucking a month. Just crank it out. Put the album out in July. It's what fucking March, April, May, June, July. Less than 6 months. In less than 6 months, that album's out on the street. And it's a smash. They knocked it out of the park. You know, they knew Bon Scott knew if he knocked it out of the park with that album, he was set for life. AC/DC knew that if they made it with that album, that they were gonna, the stage was set. Atlantic Records had, the whole thing. You could feel it building, and it blew over with that album. It was going to whether or not Bon was there. Like they had all the publicity and all the momentum, and then the fact that Bon died and they had a new singer, so the spotlight was on him, and they didn't want to have Bon Scott's name on that album. They wanted to legitimize their new lineup. So, and they also wanted to, get Brian in and be like, "You're one of us, and here's some money, and we'll put your name on there, and we'll still pay Bon Scott's parents and still pay his family the royalties that because they do." AC/DC has a non-disclosure agreement with Bon Scott's family where they're not allowed to talk about the album Back in Black and why they get money for it. Fact. And Jesse Fink, that author that wrote that book, Bond, Highway to Hell or whatever, where he says, "Yeah, man, Bon Scott wrote that album." That wasn't true. Angus Young and Brian Johnson would sue the fucking shit out of Jesse Fink for that. Because here's the thing. If they sued Jesse Fink, then they'd have to go to court and prove that they wrote those songs, and they fucking can't. I think the one time Brian Johnson said anything about it, he said something on camera to somebody or like in one of those, I don't know, Eddie Trunk interviews or something. I think AC/DC, Angus Young told him to shut the fuck up. Don't even address that issue. So that's why mum's the word. That's why everybody got real paranoid in AC/DC after the success of Back in Black and after the tour for it. And they're like, okay, now we got to follow it up. And they went to France to record For Those About to Rock. Same band, same singer, same producer, same engineer. And they had terrible time trying to come up with songs that were even comparable. My theory, even though they had Bond's notebook still for songs like Spellbound and For Those About to Rock, the title track, great songs. But the arrangement's different in a lot of it on stuff like Evil Walks and COD. Like sonically, the album sounds really good. It sounds like AC/DC. It's got Mutt Lange producing. But on over half of it, there's a good element missing. And it's the melodies and the arranging of Bon Scott. You can even have his words, but without his direct input, fell flat. And it took a long time to record that album. And I've read like kind of contemporary interviews with Angus Young, or like Angus Young reflecting back, and he's like, "Oh yeah, we had a terrible time coming up with songs. We just weren't writing the way that we used to." No shit, Sherlock. I bet not. And that's like when the whole thing really, if you look at it, Back in Black kind of it gave them a legacy career. They were able to have that kind of career where they could go and play, put out albums and play, and have people come see them. But the majority of the songs from their set list from that point on were Bon Scott songs. Songs from Back in Black were Bon Scott songs. And like two songs from whatever their current album was. that they were promoting. Right then, they fell into that because that's what they had to do. And that's when Malcolm kind of started firing everybody. Because for those about to rock, so Phil Carson, oh, I'm going to back up. Back up. Phil Carson from Atlantic almost dropped AC/DC like 1977 after Let There Be Rock. Didn't put out Dirty Deeds. Atlantic Records in the US didn't put it out, didn't think it was up to snuff. When Bon Scott died and they hired Brian Johnson, they're like, all right, let's just go to the Bahamas. Let's go to Compass Point. Let's have a mutt. And on Phil Carson and Atlantic Records, there's no way that they signed off on flying AC/DC, their crew, all their gear down to the Bahamas and paying Mutt Lang and paying that studio if they hadn't heard demos first. If they weren't sold that this new guy could not just sing, but that they had the goods to make that album. AC/DC had had one hit record, Highway to Hell, in the US. That's it. They weren't AC/DC. They weren't. So now, after Back in Black is so successful, they've got to follow it up. They've got to continue it. And that's when tension and paranoia creeps in. That's when Malcolm and Phil Rudd really both they increased their cocaine and alcohol use quite considerably. Malcolm started firing everybody. Peter Mensch, their manager, Ian Jeffrey, the tour manager, fucking Phil Rudd. A lot to that, you know. Phil got drunk. Was Phil was dating Malcolm's. I don't want to say his wife's niece, some shit like that. She was related to Linda Young. Phil had her out on a boat. She's like 16 or some shit. She's young. And she was water skiing, and he was stupid and coked up and drunk. And she got hurt because of his malfeasance, his imprudence, his carelessness. And it was kind of the final straw for Malcolm. And there were words exchanged, and Malcolm wound up beating Phil's ass, knocking him out. And within 3 hours, he was on a plane out of there, and he was fired. And that was what they were going through. That was during the making of Flick of the Switch. That was in making the follow up to For Those About to Rock, which was a reaction. You know, okay, so they hit it with Highway to Hell, Mutt Lang, great production, and then pulled it off again, Back in Black, great. So they get the same band together with the same producer and the same engineer that did Back in Black, and they can't pull it off, and so like the reaction started and the firing started, and so they go and they make Flick of the Switch back at Compass Point Studios in Bahamas, but they know they don't have Mutt Lang, fired him. Angus and Malcolm decided to produce it themselves, which sonically, um, you know, I get it. They were kind of going back. They were like, we're going to go back to roots. We're going to make a raw record that sounds like the records we made at Albert's. Well, they should have went back to Albert's and had George Young produce them, or should have had George Young come to Compass Point and produce them with Harry Vanda. But Malcolm and Angus were doing it themselves, and some decent songs. I like the album. I like Flick of the Switch a lot. It doesn't compare to the Bon Scott era. It's just slightly better than For Those About to Rock on the whole. Not as top end, doesn't have like the title track to buoy that, like the hit, you know, the iconic song. So there's none of those iconic songs with stuff like Rising Power, Guns for Hire, Nervous Shakedown. Could have been great AC/DC songs with more care into the arrangement and like better choruses. They sound great. lyrically they don't have the depth of the Bon Scott stuff, and it was not a hit. It was dead on arrival. So, like, I look at Flick of the Switch as a reaction to that Mutt Lang sound, like to kind of the gloss that goes over the top, the sparkle. Well, they got rid of all that. They also got rid of a lot of the arranging. They got rid of some of the, you know, the background vocals that made those songs so radio friendly on the Mutt Lang albums. They're nowhere to be found on Flick of the Switch. So I look at it as a reaction to the Mutt Lang sound. All right, that didn't work, so we'll do this. Well, that didn't work. So Fly on the Wall has Simon Wright on drums for the first time, and you've got Malcolm and Angus producing, and they go back to France again. So it's like they're bouncing back and forth. Like, all right, this didn't work here. Compass Point, let's go back to France. Went to I think Miraval Studios, I think in France for that one. Don't quote me. And it's just all reverb and 80s metally kind of sounding like they went so far the other fucking direction with that album because they didn't have anybody telling them, hey, you need to do this, and they didn't have the songs. And so all through the 80s they're just reacting, and Malcolm's doing more blow and getting more drunk and more agitated as to why it's not working, when the reality is it's not working because they don't have Bon Scott and they don't have Bon Scott's songs the way that they did on Back in Black. That's why all those albums, For Those About to Rock, Flick of the Switch, Fly on the Wall, Blow Up Your Video are all kind of less than the classic AC/DC albums that came before it. They're just not as good. They don't sound as good. They don't pop as hard. They don't have the great arrangements. They don't have the depth. And that's okay. There's still good songs on them. We don't have to pretend that Brian Johnson wrote Back in Black anymore because we know better. After Blow Up Your Video, when Malcolm Young just fell apart and attacked Angus physically, according to Simon Wright, there was a physical blow up, and Angus and George Young were basically like, Malcolm, you're going to rehab. You're going to get this sorted out. You're not going to go on tour. Stevie's going to go in your place. And that was the first time Stevie Young replaced Malcolm. It was on the North American 1988 Blow Up Your Video tour. Blow Up Your Video was produced by Vanda and Young, but I think Malcolm was so far gone at that point, and there's just like they were so ground down that there's like two good songs on that record. And that was the last record that Brian Johnson has a songwriting credit for AC/DC. The great Brian Johnson, who supposedly wrote all those songs on the #2 selling album of all time, hasn't written a song for AC/DC, hasn't been credited for writing a song for AC/DC since 1988. Since I was like fucking 7 years old. I was in elementary school the last time Brian Johnson had a songwriting credit on an AC/DC album. Because he's not a songwriter. He never wrote any songs, I don't think. He might have had some input on some lyrics, but he didn't bring in like, this song is going to be about that, or this, He's just not a songwriter. And throughout the 80s, there wasn't a songwriter in AC/DC. Malcolm was asleep at the wheel. He was fucked up. He was on blow and coke. So he went to rehab 1988, gets out 1989, and they write the songs for Razor's Edge with someone. I mean, let's get real. I mean, maybe Malcolm sobering up had that much of an effect. Maybe it's like, all right, I got this now. I know what to do. That's entirely possible. I've heard rumors that for the Razor's Edge, they had Desmond Child and Jim Valance come in and help them tune songs up. But the timeline of that doesn't add up as much because the way I understand it, AC/DC recorded The Razor's Edge with George Young producing. And they took it to Little Mountain in Vancouver, which is where Bob Rock and Bruce Fairbairn and Mike Fraser worked out of. Team that did the Aerosmith albums like Permanent Vacation and Pump, Dr. Feelgood, Bryan Adams, Waking Up the Neighbors. Um, they took the album up there to mix it, and there was like a couple songs that they had recorded. They took it to mix and do the vocals. Brian was going to do his vocals at Little Mountain, and they were going to mix the album there. And there were a couple of songs where the tuning was not in Brian's range; it was too high, so they had to change the tuning, like change the key of the song, the tonic. So they redid the bass and the guitars in Little Mountain, and they're this sounds great. Sounds better. So the decision was made to redo all the guitars and bass and to do the vocals at Little Mountain. And so if that were the case, maybe they rewrote the songs while they were at Little Mountain. But according to Mike Fraser, he only recorded drums on 2 songs there, like Mistress for Christmas and another one that they had written late in the game. So if the drums were already done, George Young had already recorded Chris Slade's drums before they got to Little Mountain. It'd be hard for Jim Valance and Desmond Child to have come in and like maybe they had input on the choruses. I could see that, and were like paid under the table. And the reason why Brian was taken off the credits of that album was because Angus and Malcolm knew that it was going to be a hit. Like they knew they needed a really good, solid album after everything that had happened. After, you know, Fly on the Wall and Blow Up Your Video. Oof. Those are the albums that made AC/DC a parody. They put the same album. Well, no, they didn't. They've got some really shitty ones. A couple. I mean, they're not horrible. Okay, they're still AC/DC albums. They're still better than 90% of recorded music. Uh, or 80. It's still AC/DC. Like it still rocks. It still sounds good, but like it just after a certain point, people are like, "Why am I buying this record? It sounds just like the last one, but not as good." And so Razor's Edge kind of changed that, up the game, and that's the album that took the legacy of Back in Black and everything that had happened before and cemented it. Like they were in danger of kind of falling down the slope, especially in America. And then when Razor's Edge came out, well, hell, they've not had a truly great record since. That was in 1990, 33 years ago. Um, but they haven't had to have a great record because they have all the Bon Scott stuff. And when they play shows like they're getting ready to play this Desert Trip thing, guarantee out of all their entire set list, it's going to be at bare minimum half songs from albums that Bon Scott sang on. The rest is going to be Back in Black, and maybe there's going to be 1 or 2 songs from like Power Up and Black Ice. That's it. It's how they do it. I ain't mad at them. They did what they set out to do. They wanted to rule the world with that guitar sound, and they did it with by any means possible. Not even mad at them. The fact of the matter is that they're not telling the truth about the whole Who Wrote Back in Black thing, and like the fact that the story keeps changing and the songs that Bond played drums on keep changing, and I forget who it was. It wasn't Angry Anderson. It was someone else who was offered the gig in AC/DC before. It was one of Bond's friends, and he was offered the gig before Brian took the job, and he was told that the new album had already been written, which is the only real explanation. I know a lot of people have, you know, have been told, they listened to the interviews, they seen the behind the music, and they accepted that. Everything we've ever been told is a lie. You know, Charles Manson was a patsy. Jolly West, Jolly West had his hand in so much. Look that shit up. You know, there's a reckoning coming with, you know, dark history in the world. And I'm not saying Back in Black is part of it, but as a music fan and as a huge AC/DC fan, you know, I kind of I feel insulted that that Angus and Brian at this point expect me to believe that Bon Scott didn't write those songs. Like I can hear it. I can feel it, man. You know? It's obvious, it's palpable. Just in just in the choices of the words. You compare those lyrics to Bond's lyrics, and then compare them to the lyrics in the albums that came after that Brian Johnson supposedly wrote. You know, I don't care. I'm not getting any money from it. Bon Scott's family still gets their money from it, and AC/DC is going to make a hell of a lot of money this show for Desert Trips. They're probably making $2 million for one fucking show. So like all to all the fanboys who are like wanting to talk shit and posting these big, huge, long tirades, I'm like, I'm not gonna respond to that. I don't fucking care that much. I don't have the cognitive dissonance. You know, it doesn't hurt me to understand that that ACDC did what was best for their career. That Bond was dead, and there was no changing that. And he made his decision. It wasn't the first time that he'd kind of left him in a shitty position with his drug use. You know, it was just the last. And they had a contingency plan in place for that because it was a very real possibility. Like they were aware, you know, and I can still listen to Back in Black and appreciate it for what it is and know that Bond wrote those songs. That's why it was in that Bonfire box set. It's not because it was a tribute to him, it's because it was his crowning fucking achievement. And he knew it. He was ready for that. It's just a dumbass. Fucking did a line of smack. It could have happened to me. It's happened to my friends. But don't get it twisted. Uh, it's not a tribute to Bond. There's nothing about that album that's a tribute to Bond other than the fact that it's his album. He wrote it, he arranged it. Those are his melodies. I mean, I'm sure a few of his lyrics and his song titles. Like, no, no, he fucking arranged that album. He wrote those melodies. Those are his songs. It's his life. There's nothing anybody's gonna say. It's gonna make me hear it any differently. You know, I'm not the world's foremost music scholar, right? But I know my shit. I know what I'm listening to. Bon Scott wrote Back in Black. It's his life. Like, I didn't even get into the Jesse Fink shit. Jesse Fink breaks it down. He breaks down the lyrics, and he's talked to Bond's girlfriends, and he's pieced the thing together on a different level. I'm just going off of me, what I've heard and what I believe. What's obvious to me by listening to the fucking record that I grew up with, that we've all heard so many times. Anybody anybody who's a casual AC/DC fan, you're still fucking listening to this, you're compelled somehow by this story. Pick up one of those other albums or just go on Spotify and listen to Fly on the Wall. Tell me you think the same fucking person wrote those songs. Tell me, yeah, it's the same songwriter. It's obvious because it's not. You're like, ugh, took a hard left somewhere. And it's no one's fault, you know. I We are who we are. If I was in the same position, I would write songs and make records too. Try. So they tried. The only one of the 80s, yeah, like I said, for those about to rock sounds good. It's like sonically a good album, and you put like I have the original LP that was mastered by Robert Ludwig at Masterdisc. Sounds great. I mean, Tony Platt engineered it. Mutt Lang produced it. It was mastered by Robert Ludwig. Press's specialty. Yeah, turn it up. It sounds amazing, but just sonically, like the songs aren't great. I kind of like Flick of the Switch better. It's more raw. They're not even trying there. They're like, fuck it, let's just, you know, basically make a punk AC/DC album. Yeah. Um, and that's like the only one out of all those that for those about to rock through blow up your video. And I'm not counting who made who in that because it's a compilation. It's got 3 new songs. 2 of them are instrumentals. They're great. Who made who's the shit. Getting George Young and Harry Vanda back definitely helped them for a song. So when they did blow up your video, they had 2 songs that were good. Heat Seeker and That's the Way I Want to Rock and Roll. Like, Go Zone's okay. Kissin' Dynamite is just it's like AC/DC by numbers. It's a parody of itself by that point. Whereas, the Bon Scott stuff is so again, it's on just a different level. So anyway, that's my response. Instead of like sitting and typing, I had to smoke a blunt and just talk about it because I'm not gonna fucking sit and keyboard warrior with people. It's fucking ridiculous, right? Have a good night.